الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Safiya, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam, as it is practiced here and in other parts of the world. In this episode, Surah Al-Fatiha. It's been called the greatest chapter of the Quran. What is so special about this chapter? We'll answer that question a bit later in the show, but first, the pursuit of knowledge. The Quran emphasizes the importance of seeking knowledge. What sort of knowledge is the Quran most concerned about? Is it just religious knowledge, or is it every kind of knowledge? How should a Muslim go about seeking knowledge? With me to discuss the pursuit of knowledge, Dr. Shabir Ali, President of the Islamic Information Center. Dr. Shabir, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
Pleasure to be on.
So what sort of knowledge does the Quran talk about in the verses that mention knowledge?
The Quran speaks of knowledge in a very broad way and does not restrict it to a particular type of knowledge. The view taken in the Quran is that knowledge leads to God. And if one were to pursue knowledge, then one would come to a closer understanding of God and a better relationship with Him.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us some examples of verses that highlight this connection between knowing and getting closer to God? Yes,
in one verse the Quran says, "Hal yastawi alladhina ya'lamuna walladhina la ya'lamun." Are the people who are knowledgeable on the same level as those who are not knowledgeable? And in another verse, the Quran says, "Yarfa Allahu alladhina amanu minkum alladhina utul ilma darajat." God will raise in degrees those among you who have been given knowledge. Mm-hmm. So the idea here is that we rise in closeness in degrees. We get closer and closer to God by the acquisition of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So is it limited to religious knowledge, or is it secular knowledge as well? What sort of knowledge do you think?
Obviously, the religious knowledge is very important, and some verses of the Quran do emphasize the religious knowledge. In the 9th chapter of the Quran, for example, it says that even when some persons go out to serve the Muslim community by defending its frontiers, there should be some left behind who can devote themselves to knowledge, so that when those soldiers return, the ones who have been devoted to knowledge can educate them. Mm-hmm. And that shows while physical defense against real dangers facing the community is of such utmost urgency, even then there should be some people who are just simply devoted to knowledge, because when those soldiers return, they will have to be educated. Looking at the excesses that are often reported from soldiers operating in many different parts of the world, we see how important it is for soldiers themselves to have a sound moral grounding, and much of that comes from religious training. And hence we understand the Quran's dictate here that there should be some people who are devoted to knowledge, so that even the soldiers can receive their education at the hands of these people.
Mm-hmm. Did the Prophet Muhammad himself emphasize knowledge?
Yes, and if you don't mind, I want to just add the other part, that you asked whether religious knowledge alone,
mm-hmm.
and
whether
yes,
it's wider,
exactly,
knowledge in a wider sense.
Mm-hmm. So the Quran actually emphasizes the non-religious type, but people might call non-religious type of knowledge as well. For example, the Quran says, "Qul siru fil ard," travel in the world, and then see how God has initiated creation. And many such verses that actually emphasize traveling. Mm-hmm. And nowadays people will travel for leisure and pleasure. And some do travel for the purpose of seeking specific types of education. But here the idea of traveling has been mentioned very broadly as a means of acquiring knowledge. And indeed, when people travel, they are forced to think outside of the box. They meet new people, they experience different phenomena, and that forces them to think and to revise what they thought they knew. So traveling is one of the most important ways of receiving knowledge, and this is mentioned so prominently in the Quran.
And it seems like the Quran is not just talking about the traditional book learning that we think of when we think of knowledge, but also, exploring, observing the world, observing nature.
Yes.
Many verses say, "Have you not seen how we did this or how we did this?"
Yes, in fact, the Quran calls on people to look around, look at the heavens, see if you can find any fault in it, see how God has created so many different creatures. Some walk on two, some walk on four, some crawl on the ground. The Quran describes some of the processes that I felt I was being taught for the first time in high school, when we learned about weather systems and how the wind blows and gathers moisture, forming it into clouds, and from those heavy clouds the rain descends. This is mentioned in the Quran in great detail. So the Quran is not averse to knowledge, rather it sees knowledge as a very integral part of a human being's response to God.
In the early Muslim community, was there a new emphasis on knowledge? I know in the past, perhaps, or in the time of the Prophet, people were now reciting the Quran, memorizing the Quran, writing it down. Was this something that was new to the community?
In fact, prior to the revelation of the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that age is referred to as the age of Jahiliyyah, of ignorance. And Muslims see it this way largely because the revelation gave a fresh perspective on life. And this comes to be known as the knowledge, as real learning. And therefore, by contrast, that is the period of ignorance. It doesn't mean that people were entirely ignorant, but one of the features that we notice that characterizes this early population was the basic situation of illiteracy, in that the persons who were known to be able to read and write were very few. Such that we know at the famous incident of Badr that some of the captives were set free on condition that they would teach children to recite, they will teach the knowledge of writing to the children. And that meant that there were only such few people, and this was the early Muslim community did not have that many people, and some of the outsiders had to be employed for the purpose of teaching the children. But of course, this changed with the revelation of the Quran. And you asked me about the Prophet's perspective on this. It is reported that he said, "Talabul ilmi faridatun ala kulli Muslim." The seeking of knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim. So now we think of it's obligatory to offer the 5 daily prayers, for example. But according to this statement, it's also obligatory to seek knowledge.
In our modern sense, part of learning is having an open mind and exposing oneself to all sorts of things, and taking the good from whatever what is available to oneself. Is this understanding also within Islam, or perhaps in the Quranic point of view as well?
Yes, although of course one would not guess this from the organization of Muslim communities. One would see that Muslim communities are so organized, at least where Muslims are majorities in many parts of the world, that there seems to be a sort of a closeness. The apostate is threatened with death, and anyone who says anything contrary to what are the known and governing principles of the land can be severely harassed and find himself in deep trouble. So there's a sort of closeness, a closed-mindedness that seems to prevail in many parts of the Muslim world. But this is not a characteristic of Islam, actually. If we take the Quran as what really represents the Muslim faith, well, we see that the Quran mentions the sayings of other people who are very critical of Islam, people who are very critical of God, critical of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, critical of the Quran itself, and their criticisms are mentioned and of course also answered. And in the Quran we have both their statements and the answers to their claims and their objections and criticisms. Nowadays it seems that people find it objectionable even if you mention the criticism of others. For example, if you're delivering a sermon, you just mentioned that such and such a person says this thing, and this is how you reply to them. Somebody may ask you afterwards, well, why did you mention their saying? Because they think that just by merely mentioning the sayings of the others, you might somehow sow doubt in the minds of some people who are hearing the objection for the first time, which means that they do not really have confidence in the response to the objection. And they don't have confidence that the Islamic faith is so firm and so well put together and utterly coherent that they're afraid that if people hear objections, that will be a reason for them to leave Islam or to have doubts lingering in their minds about Islam. Whereas the Quran took an entirely different approach by mentioning the criticisms of others and then mentioning also the response to those criticisms.
All right, very interesting response. Thank you for that, Bashir.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, we look at Surah Al-Fatiha.